Mexican Revolution. Finally, the people of Mexico were rebelling against Porfirio Diaz's regime. A former roadside bandit named Pancho Villa led rebel armies to attack the north near the U.S. border, while another rebellious leader named Emiliano Zapata started a revolt in the southern regions of the country. The Mexican Revolution was so large and violent that Porfirio Diaz had fled the country into exile in France. Francisco Madero had intended to become the next president of Mexico, but the revolution had gotten out of his control. Decades of repressed anger from the common people had exploded into chaos. More rebellions, now against Madero, had erupted. The United States saw this political chaos in Mexico as perfect for installing a puppet president named Victoriano Huerta through a coup. He proved to be immediately corrupt, which only caused more uprisings. The rebel forces grew even stronger and larger. They were encroaching on Mexico City when Huerta fled to exile in the United States. The rebels would then finally capture the capital. Disagreements between the different revolutionary leaders, however, led to a war between revolutionary armies. Pancho Villa would then be driven back north and would blame his defeats on the United States, which supported the less radical revolutionary Carranza. He then attacked the American town of Columbus, New Mexico, which caused American forces to attempt to hunt him down. Pancho Villa successfully evaded the Americans, however. Carranza then wrote a new constitution for Mexico, which contained workers' rights that were long overdue. He then successfully had Zapata assassinated. Carranza's right-hand man, Obregón, had been slowly pushed out of the political arena by Carranza as the war was drawing to a close. The angered Obregón attempted another coup and took power. He made many reforms to Mexico, and the country finally became stable again after a decade of brutal civil war and violence. Just when things got a little more peaceful, Obregón was assassinated by a radical Catholic extremist. The next democratically elected president of Mexico was Plutarco Elias Calles, who was a revolutionary socialist. Dutch Indonesia. Throughout the 1800s, after the Netherlands had been ravaged by the Napoleonic Wars, the new Dutch monarchy had to find a way to bring back the military to its past high economic status. The only colonies that the Netherlands still held on to after the decline of the Dutch colonial empire were the Dutch East Indies. The spice trade was not nearly as lucrative as it once was back in the 1600s. The Netherlands tried to tax the wealthy land-owning local sultans, but this would end in rebellions that had to be stamped out by the Dutch armies. Shortly after, coffee plantations, rubber plantations, and cocoa plantations were made so that the local farmers could pay the Dutch in their goods rather than their money. It proved to maximize profits for the Netherlands, but at the cost of the Indonesian farmers overworking themselves tirelessly to satiate Dutch greed. During the late 1800s, the rest of the European colonial powers took part in the scramble for Africa. Southeast Asia was also a major region of the world that the Europeans began to colonize. As the British Empire, French Empire, and the German Empire began to scramble for Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, the Netherlands had conquered almost the entirety of the islands of Indonesia. Profits from gold, oil, and tea exports also began to skyrocket once the Dutch had conquered the region. During the earlier 1900s, the Dutch had built modern infrastructure in Indonesia, and the Indonesian people were becoming more educated. And with increased education came a desire for independence. The Old Republic. The country was prospering for its wealthy land-owning elites through the production of cash crops, such as coffee and rubber. It became so successful that slavery was no longer needed and it was abolished. The military and the civilian population, however, became increasingly critical of the monarch, who had kept society stagnant and similar to the colonial feudalism of old. There were several socialist uprisings all around the country because of this. This caused the military to enact a coup and seize power. In place of the monarchy, a republic was established that was inspired by the Enlightenment ideals of republicanism brought to Brazil mainly by German and Italian immigrants. Almost immediately, Brazil became a corrupt dictatorship which only benefited powerful elites which owned the cash crop plantations who once owned massive numbers of slaves. The coffee presidents, as they are referred to by historians, did improve financial institutions and increased urbanization. The lower classes during the 1920s had revolted against the government and the elites. This rebellion failed, and the elites still managed to stay in control. The Brazilian people of the urban areas would still have dreams of freedom from their corrupt oligarchy one day. The Roaring Twenties. In the very next decade after the Great War, the economy of the United States had reached unprecedented heights. Through the implementation of laissez-faire capitalism, businesses skyrocketed in wealth. The automotive industry, the aviation industry, and the electronics industry had prospered during this time. The German-settled Great Lakes region was the main productive powerhouse of the U.S. The new American standard of living was made possible by the mass normalization of credit debt. This was also the decade where women were empowered to wear makeup regularly, dress in more revealing clothes, smoke, and dance. This was due to women very recently getting voting rights. Though the upper class and middle classes were much richer during this time, the working class, which mainly worked in industrial jobs and agricultural work, were still poor and exploited. The 1920s were marked by reactionary government policies, along with racial hatred and animosity towards non-whites. The Ku Klux Klan had made a resurgence in America, even outside of the South. Immigration from countries perceived as having inferior races were greatly limited. Christian fundamentalists had advocated for the abolition of the teaching of evolution in schools. Alcohol would be outlawed to prevent violence and deaths, but would only lead to increased illegal distribution of alcoholic beverages. German Americans during this time were looked down upon because of what the German Empire did in the Great War. Many monolingual German speakers in America were pressured to only speak English when out in public, as to not be accused of being a spy. Some of their culture was suppressed as well. Cristero War. During the 1920s, the Mexican government under President Calles had begun to establish many socialist reforms to improve the quality of life for the working class in Mexico. But eventually, he began to make radical, overtly anti-religious policies against the Catholic churches all over the country. These policies were meant to forcefully weed out all religious practices from public life. This greatly angered much of the population, especially in the more religious rural areas, as their freedom of religion was being eroded. After many ignored protests, the country erupted into an armed rebellion once again. Most of these angry mobs of peasant farmers in central Mexico declared holy war against the atheist government. They were referred to as the Cristeros, and they enacted guerrilla warfare tactics. The United States had gotten involved and made deals with President Calles to repeal the anti-Catholic reforms, as exiled Cristeros in the U.S. had brought light to the events unfolding to the American public. Eventually, the Cristeros' demands were met and the rebellions had ceased. From this point onward, Mexico would be a stable, one-party state for a long period of time. German immigration to Argentina. Directly after the Great War, many Germans decided to mass exodus out of Europe to Argentina. Europe, after the Great War, was in a transitional period where the bloated monarchies of old had collapsed, either through war or revolution, and there was great fear and confusion. The economy of Germany had gotten extreme. Argentina still had large amounts of depopulated land in its southern Patagonian frontier regions. The few native Amerindian tribes who remained there after the Argentine conquests of the deserts of Patagonia were the Mapuche tribes. The Mapuche were skilled silversmiths and textile craftsmen. The Germans immigrating to Argentina began to establish their own farms for agricultural production and a simpler life. Brazilian Revolution of 1930. The agrarian oligarchy of Brazil was just barely being held together despite the overwhelming resentment by the majority of the population during the later 1920s. Many young tenants within the Brazilian military had also become discontent with the old coffee and dairy industries controlling the corrupt government. In the year 1929, the global stock market had crashed, which had disrupted the oligarchy so much so that new democratic parties in Brazil had formed in hopes of finally pushing for change. A politician named Getúlio Vargas had run for presidential election. He had gained the vast majority of the vote in 1930, but the elections had been tampered with, and another agrarian oligarch had become president. The military had reached a breaking point and enacted a coup of the government, which was also supported by working class and middle class rebels. There were also many different militant political movements, which were a mixture of communist and fascist ideologies. The military took control of the main population centers of the country, and eventually installed Vargas as president. The Weimar Republic. After the overthrow of the Imperial German Second Reich and the downfall of its vast colonial empire during the Great War, the Weimar Republic was founded, which was the first true democracy in the entire history of Germany. The Allied powers then demanded war reparations from Germany despite them not being responsible for starting the Great War. During the early years, Marxists were trying to take over the government to establish socialism, which failed due to right-wing militias working for the government. The country began to suffer from hyperinflation in the immediate aftermath of the war, due to having to print more and more cash, to the point where 4,210,500,000,000 German paper marks equaled one single American dollar. That was until 1924, when Germany had to borrow large sums of money from the US to be able to survive without extreme mass poverty. There was some stability both politically and economically that was starting. There was a time of great social progress during the Goldenen Zwanziger, as it was called. Berlin became a hub for sociologists, scientists, artists, and musicians. Women's suffrage had been granted. There were also new political movements forming. The same things were happening in Austria and other Germanic regions. Like the US, it became socially acceptable for women to have shorter haircuts, revealing clothes, cigarettes, and makeup. This was until 1929, when the global stock market had crashed, which started the Great Depression. Many countries throughout the capitalist world had become extremely impoverished. This made people extremely politically polarized, which made democratic elections impossible to please the population. Everyone was either a nationalist, a Marxist, an anarchist, a hyper-capitalist, or just wanted the Kaiserreich back. There was also a brand new political coalition which staunchly opposed all liberalism, called the National Socialist Party, the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. During the Great War, the Russian Empire had collapsed, into a chaotic power vacuum between various different political factions. Amidst the chaos, the Bolsheviks had seized power over the country. This is when the Volga German Soviet Socialist Republic had been created. Many quick reforms were made by the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, to help peasants take control of the land they harvested on, distribute food and resources to the poor, and began to industrialize the country. However, Lenin had been executing his political opponents and rigged the first elections made by the new democratic system. The people attempted to rebel and overthrow the Bolshevik government. They were a group of political parties who opposed Lenin called the White Russians, while the Red Russians were the Bolsheviks and their supporters. The two groups fought each other in the middle of a delicate transitional state of Russia, which caused mass deaths from famines. Eventually, the Red Russians prevailed and sent most of the White Russians to Siberian labor camps called gulags. In these gulags, they would be overworked in the most unbearable of conditions, which caused extreme suffering and mass deaths. Throughout the 1920s, after the Great War, Lenin made more socialist reforms, but became extremely stressed due to having to work extra hard to keep huge populations of Russians from starving to death. He started to have debilitating strokes that would greatly limit his authoritative abilities. His close successors, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, were competing against each other in who would become the next leader of the Soviet Union, beginning of the Mexican drug cartels. In the 1920s, the United States government had outlawed one of man's most powerful vices, alcohol. This ban on alcohol was called prohibition. Prohibition did not prevent Americans from drinking alcohol, however. The demand for it was made even greater, and the Sicilian Mafia had a large role in trafficking alcohol through the black market. Many Americans in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California would go on vacations down in Mexico just to be able to drink alcohol legally. Mexicans began to smuggle alcohol across the border into the states to sell to Americans. This proved to be very profitable. With more profits came more organization. Eventually, the first Mexican drug cartel had formed in the border town of Matamoros in the state of Tamaulipas. This was known as the Gulf Cartel, the first drug cartel. Modernization of South Africa. After the Second Anglo-Boer War, which had all of far southern Africa fall to British colonialism, the Boers slowly and gradually, through diplomacy, gained more rights and semi-autonomy over the region. The territory would then become the Union of South Africa. The British still controlled the region during these times, but just not as much as before. This also included the territory of what used to be the German colony of Namibia after the Great War. The coloreds, Indians, and natives still struggled as second-class citizens, while a semi-autonomous constitutional monarchy that was equal status to England within the empire. The British had heavily industrialized many parts of South Africa and gave it the modernization that was greatly needed. Before British colonization, the Boers and the native populations were very technologically behind Europe and very agrarian. South Africa also exported massive amounts of gold throughout the British Empire. Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. In mid-1920s Weimar Germany, the new leader of the German National Socialist Party, named Adolf Hitler, with his radicalized militia, had attempted to overthrow the government in the city of Munich. This was called the Beer Hall Putsch. This insurrection failed, however, and Adolf was thrown in prison for treason against the government. He had spent 9 months in prison and wrote a new political manifesto. As soon as he was released, the book was published. This manifesto was called Mein Kampf. The success of this book had made Hitler millions. In Mein Kampf, Hitler writes about the Germanic races, such as Germans, Scandinavians, and Anglos being part of the superior master race that he calls the Aryans. Hitler confused the term with the Indo-Aryan people, who had migrated from the Eastern European steppes into ancient northern India. Germans are descended from a different group of Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Aryans would later create the religion of Hinduism in ancient India. The swastika was originally a Hindu symbol that was later adopted by the National Socialists. Hitler considered many other races to be inferior subhumans compared to the Aryans. Hitler had a particular disdain towards the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, especially because of the existence of the Soviet Union. But there was one ethnic group which Hitler despised the most: the Jews. He believed that the Jews were an insidious cabal that pulled the strings of modern politics and culture behind the scenes to try to subvert traditional Aryan values through liberalism, Marxism, and social progress. Hitler wrote about Lebensraum, which was a term meant to refer to the outer non-Aryan lands of the earth that needed to be conquered, ethnically cleansed, and colonized by Aryan settlers. Hitler believed that the Aryans must inherit the entire rest of the world while exterminating all of the inferior races. He took inspiration from the American Manifest Destiny, where the United States would conquer Native American lands, brutally crush their rebellions, and allow only white settlers to homestead the land. Finally, Hitler would then refer to himself as the Führer, as the new form of ultimate authority over Germany. The imprisonment of Adolf Hitler had only made his popularity with the German population skyrocket. The extremely weak Weimar Republic had gotten Hitler elected into power. A bloody coup was then enacted where the most important Weimar politicians were all assassinated. Hitler and his loyal followers then seized total power over all of Germany. He then created the Gestapo, a secret police force that suppressed political dissent. The totalitarian reign of the Führer had just begun.